So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christian Morgner. I'm one of the conveners of the British Sociological Association's theory group, and I would like to welcome you to this event. This event, as I've mentioned in my previous introductions, is part of a series that is dedicated to influential sociological thinkers. And in this series, we want to revisit sociological thinkers from the perspective of contemporary issues and debates. In particular, our talks focus on debating established narratives of great thinkers or the classic, but also relate social thinkers to contemporary issues like race, colonial issues, rapid social change. To deliver this agenda, we will focus on a recent publication by Gurminder, Bhambra and John Holmwood, which is called Colonialism in Modern Theory. So that's the book. I will also put later on a flyer in the chat with the discount code. So in case you don't yet have a copy of the book, we can also do a little bit of a promotion with this one. And we also put Twitter about it. So in case you miss it, then the discount code will also be on Twitter. We really hope that these discussions will demonstrate the relevance or the relevance of these social thinkers and usefulness of sociological theory on the whole. So today's event consists of 4 scholars who are widely published on this subject, and let me briefly introduce them. So first and foremost, Gurminder Bhambra is Professor of Colonial and Post-Colonial Studies in the Department of International Relations and the School of Global Studies. Before joining the University of Sussex, she was Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick. She was also Guest Professor of Sociology and History at the Center for Concurrences in Colonial and Post-Colonial Studies, Linnaeus University, Sweden, and a visiting professor at the EHESS in Paris. And she was visiting fellow in the Department of Sociology at Princeton University. Professor Bhambra's first monograph, Rethinking Modernity, Post-Colonialism and the Sociological Imagination, published by Palgrave in 2007, won the prestigious 2008 Philip Abrams Memorial Prize in Sociology. Her research is on Eurocentric accounts of the emergence and development of modernity and was developed further into her project on connected histories, proposing a new global sociology, which can be found in her second book, Connected Sociologies, published by Bloomsbury in 2014. She has been editor of a number of books in this field and is the series editor for Theory for a Global Age series published by Manchester University Press. Professor Bhambra is also hosting the Global Social Theory website and is convener of the Post-Colonial and Decolonial Transformation Study Group, also here at the BSA. John Holmwood is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the School of Sociology and Social Policy, at the University of Nottingham. Having joined the school in January 2010, he was previously Professor of Sociology at the Universities of Edinburgh, Sussex, and Birmingham. Professor Holmwood is co-founder and joint managing director of Discover Society, a free online monthly magazine of social research, criticism, and policy analysis. He was co-founder of the campaign for the Public University 2010 to 2017, and he was actually also president of the British Sociological Association between 2012 and 2014. Professor Holmwood researches sociological theory, social inequality, higher education, and religion and schooling. He has particular interests in public sociology and the colonial construction of sociologies and publics. He was an expert witness for the defense in professional misconduct cases brought against teachers accused to plot to Islamize school in Birmingham, the so-called Trojan Horse Affair, which resulted in a book co-authored with Teresa O'Toole called Countering Extremism in British Schools: The Truth About the Birmingham Trojan Horse Affair, which was published by Policy Press in 2018. He also edited with John Scott the Handbook of British Sociology published by Palgrave Macmillan. Professor Bhambra and Professor Holmwood will be joined by Dr. Ipek Demir and Dr. Stephen Kemp, which will present in alphabetical order. Dr. Ipek Demir is Associate Professor of the Sociology at the University of Leeds. She completed her PhD in Social and Political Thought at the University of Sussex. Before joining the University of Leeds, she held an ESRC postdoctoral fellowship at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge and worked as a lecturer at the Department of Sociology at the University of Leicester. Dr. Demir's research sits at the intersections of the fields of diaspora studies, ethnopolitics, race and identity, global south, social and critical thought. She has published numerous papers in academic journals like the Global South, Critical Discourse Studies, or Discover Society. She also co-authored a book with Professor Bhambra called 1968 in Retrospect History, Theory, Alterity, published by Springer. And she has a forthcoming book called Diaspora as Translation in Decolonialization. Dr. Kemp is senior lecturer at the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. He completed his PhD at the Department of Sociology at the same university. Before joining the University of Edinburgh, he was a research assistant at the University of Bristol, and he held a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Sussex. Dr. Kemp's research is in the area of social theory, and he has particular interest in debates about scientific knowledge about fundamental features of the social world. He has published in numerous papers in academic journals like Sociological Theory, Social Epistemology, and Sociology. His paper, Evaluating Interests in Social Science Beyond Objectivist Evaluation and the Non-Judgmental Stance, published in Sociology, received the Sage Prize for Innovation and Excellence. So thank you to all of you for joining and attending today's event. Just to say a few words about the event itself, and for the audience that has joined us, the event will last for about 90 minutes. In the first half of the event, we will start off with a brief discussion of the book, which is followed by replies by the other discussants that I just introduced. And after that, we will open the forum to all of you for a more general discussion and continuing our debate. I also have to say, please note that today's event will be recorded and made available on the website of the British Sociological Association. So if you don't want your image to be made available in that way, please either use the chat function for the discussion, which I will be going to monitor, or please turn off your camera. Okay, so that is what I wanted to say about the outline of the event. Let's start with our discussion. So my first question is for Professor Bhambra and Professor Holmwood. And I was wondering, given this really insightful publication, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what motivated you to writing this book.
Thanks so much for the introduction there, Christian. And it's really nice to see everybody here in this virtual space. The book, I guess it's come out of long-standing conversations really about, both John and I have taught social theory modules, John for longer than I have, but nonetheless, in the context of teaching these modules, one of the things that often came up for discussion was this fact that the thinkers that we were talking about lived during many of the fundamental processes of colonialism that I was interested in otherwise. And yet it appeared, at least from the secondary treatments, that they had nothing to say about colonialism or empire or these bigger processes. And thought that it was a bit odd that they wouldn't have had anything to say. And so in the context of that thought, we went back and read through many of these thinkers and discovered that actually they did have things to say, or that it was impossible that their work could have been uninfluenced by the histories that they were living through. And so I think one of the things that we were interested to do in the context of this book in particular was to think about what it was that they did have to say about these processes, what it was that we might think about how they interpreted or analyzed these processes, but also to take on board the issue of the silences that then emerged within the debates around these thinkers. Like, why does the way in which Locke and Hobbes in the early sections, or then Tocqueville, why does their work on the colonial histories disappear from subsequent sociological engagement with their work? So that was one of the key motivations. I don't know, John, do you want to add something?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't planned, and in a sense it is accidental, but it is exactly 50 years since the publication of Tony Giddens's Capitalism and Modern Social Theory, which I think was quite a decisive book in British social thought and in the development of the curriculum in classical social theory within British universities. It's an important moment because he's, in a sense, engaging with the Parsonian construction of modernity and how Parsons represented a particular set of theorists as foundational in particular for our purposes, Durkheim and Weber, and puts Marx into the prehistory. So Giddens is, in a sense, refocusing and recovering and recuperating Marx in that way, in order to bring class into the center of sociological debates. And I think that was very much a strong aspect and feature of the development of sociology after the formation of of new departments after the Robbins reforms of higher education in the late 60s and so on. So that was decisive, and yet there's not a single mention. Well, we found one mention of colonialism in Giddens's book. So we kind of thought, well, it's interesting how, if you like, class was made central, and now class is coming as a concept, is increasingly criticized in relation to intersections of gender, but also of race, and thinking that one of the reasons why it's difficult to understand the place of race within contemporary sociology is, in a sense, that we don't have a proper understanding of the place of colonialism in the development of capitalist modernity. And so Giddens would be one of those writers that we think takes the classical tradition, and obviously all readings of a tradition are necessarily editings of that tradition. So we're not sort of criticizing him for being selective, but interestingly, what happens is a purification of the histories of colonialism, and in a sense, a representation of what we think is increasingly a false history of modernity, but a false history of modernity that has consequence for how we think about the present. So, but as Gurminder was suggesting, our project isn't a work of rejection, it is also a work of recuperation, recognizing that something about the way in which colonialism is treated in the theorists of the past makes it possible to purify their work, and how we now understand colonialism differently enables us to return to their work to see what kind of difference it makes to the concepts that they have otherwise bequeathed to us.
Thank you. So, I mean, John and Gurminder, you've mentioned already, two very eminent scholars in a sense that have sort of, undergone like a similar project. Halcott Parsons, sort of, having sort of, revised the classics and sort of, try to systematize them and sort of, provide a new account in terms of sociological theory. And then John, you've mentioned the role of Anthony Giddens, sort of, making a kind of a similar attempt of, again, also, looking at the tradition and, more from the perspective of class and so forth. And so, I mean, this is quite a huge project. And when I looked at the book, I mean, it's, so, I mean, for those sort of, you haven't yet read the book, I mean, you're going through a very long tradition, starting from Thomas Hobbes, so, all the way to Du Bois. So, I mean, you're covering about, 200 to 300 years in terms of sociological, history. So I kind of wondered, I mean, how did then you sort of, try to engage with this classical tradition? What was, in a sense, your take on it? How did you sort of, try to overcome some of the sort of, limitations and challenges of some of these previous authors?
I think it, in a way, it was, again, want to stress, we're not arguing a rejectionist position. And so we're not saying that thinking about modern social theory is a problem and we have to do things completely differently. So what was helpful was to, in a sense, think of the kinds of editing that had taken place. So one always gets the creation of a canon. The canon is a kind of a shorthand. So other people have been engaged with putting other figures into the canon, and that's obviously incredibly important work. But the selection of the figures that we looked at was important from our perspective, both to say, well, these are figures who are in everybody's teaching already, so let's keep with them, and then let's make additions insofar as those additions help us to make sense of things. So to go back to Hobbes and Locke in order to understand that the way in which Hobbes and Locke have otherwise been thought of is the originators of the idea of possessive individualism, with possessive individualism a kind of prefiguring of capitalism. So what we want to say, well, it's odd to think of them imagining something that has yet to come into being, rather than commenting on something they're already experiencing and were in fact directly engaged with by virtue of their positions either within the Royal African Company or within various colonial ventures in the Americas. So by doing that, then that created an initial shift, and that brought us to thinking of, well, Tocqueville is sometimes in, sometimes out, but he's quite crucial for understanding the role of democracy in the way in which democracy has figured in thinking about the twin revolutions, democratic revolution, industrial revolution, and at the same time is carried forward because he relates to things strongly that Du Bois is saying. So we are in a way looking at the national, how sociology in the post-war period comes to be focused upon national projects for sociology, to trace back to the international that is colonialism and empire, and then to connect to Du Bois as bringing sociology back into the international with a recognition of a global color line. So the authors were selected pragmatically from what everybody would be anyway engaging with, and then adding in so that we could have threads that moved between the different authors and encompass a range of issues that we wanted to address.
I mean, one thing that I'd sort of add to that perhaps is, sort of picking up this issue that all processes of canon formation are processes of selection and so on, and thinking about the fact that when Parsons, who's perhaps central to the establishment of this idea of the 1890-1920 tradition, he's writing in the 1930s about this and sort of forming a particular understanding of sociology at that time, and yet has no engagement with the work of Du Bois, whose Philadelphia Negro came out in 1895, who at the time that Parsons is writing this, is writing his own magisterial Black Reconstruction and so on, and yet has no place within the understanding of sociology as a discipline as Parsons is setting out. So we sort of thought that it was interesting in terms of bringing Du Bois in. It's not just in terms of that he's been a neglected scholar, but if we are to take Du Bois seriously, then what would it mean for how we need to rethink the canon as it has been presented otherwise? And so even though Du Bois in a way comes at the end, he's also there at the beginning in terms of thinking about how we shape our engagement with the other scholars that we're working with, and thinking about the threads that could connect our interpretations across the various tradition, the thinkers within that tradition.
So just a quick, follow-up question on this, Gurminder. I find it really interesting. So what do you think needs to change in terms of the canon? What is it in a sense, and in terms of the construction of the canon, right? I mean, John, and you mentioned, sometimes certain authors are in, sometimes certain authors are out. So I think there is obviously not just this question of, we should add someone who has been neglected, also who wasn't in there, but there's also this broader conceptual question, how sociology in general constructs what it considers to be its canon. So I wonder if that was also something you explored, this kind of bigger picture, and how this stuff needs to be revised.
I mean, I think in that context, what we're sort of less interested in the figures in themselves than what they've contributed to the shaping of the discipline, the conceptual architecture of the discipline that they have established. And the concern that we've always had is that if you just argue for getting rid of these figures, then you could do that, but the ideas, the concepts, the categories that they have come up with are still central to the way in which the discipline is organized. And if we continue to use those, then actually we are reproducing things that we think of as problematic. So we're less interested in the individuals as such than what they have given to sociology, and thinking about how, if we were to take colonialism seriously, we can then transform those concepts and categories to make them more useful for the sort of work that we're wanting to do with them. And so in that sense, sort of, it's about thinking about colonialism as a serious world historical event, one which isn't directly engaged with by these thinkers, and yet they lived through it. And so pulling that to the fore of what it is that they had to say and didn't say, and then rethinking their work in order to open up further avenues for discussion. So in that sense, I know sometimes people argue either for the rejection of the canon or for adding to the canon. I think what we're calling for is a transformation of the categories of the canon.
Thank you, Gurminder. John, do you want to add anything to this? Otherwise, if I'd like move on to my final question.
No, I think that's a very comprehensive account.
Okay. So I think, I mean, one of the sort of, other innovations I really liked about this book was that, again, when you think about some of the authors, you've cited and referred to, is that was actually written by two individuals, because, most of the other books, Tycho Parsons, Anthony Giddens, these were all like, sole authored monographs. And to a certain extent, as, part of the kind of vision of the great thinker is that sole individual, but yet, so here we have a really sort of, innovative theoretical book that has been written by two individuals. So therefore, I kind of wondered if you could also, tell us a bit more about sort of, how you did that. So, what did your practice of, of co-authoring this book look like?
Well, we do think of sociology as a dialogue. So in that sense, it's natural to conduct it as a dialogue. We think of it as a dialogue with the authors we're engaged with, as well as a dialogue with ourselves and between ourselves. And I think that one way of thinking about it as a dialogue, and I think possibly the practice that we did it as a dialogue, is that I think were much more engaged with our authors from the perspective of thinking about what it was they were saying, trying to appreciate what they were saying. So I hope that our practice of writing carries over into our way of reading, in the sense that we are generous in our critiques. That is, we're trying to find the best, but not allied any difficulties within the work. So in that sense, it was enjoyable to engage with them, and then enjoyable to engage with each other, because I think the book is a conversation about a conversation. Obviously, we each took initial responsibility for different chapters. We discussed them in advance, then we prepared drafts, and then Dropbox was very useful, and we then commented on each other's drafts, discuss them further. So I'd say that there's nothing that isn't jointly written, but the jointly written starts from a process of individual contributions moderated through conversation and criticism. So so actually I have to say it was fun to write, which is, sometimes it's hard work writing, but this was fun to write. So it would be nice if it's fun to read as well.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that I think while I agree with John, we didn't come at this from a pure critique angle. It was an attempt to have a generous reading, but I think some people might think that we weren't quite so generous to Weber as we were to the other authors. And indeed, in John's first draft of Durkheim, as I think William also picked up because he read an early draft of it, it was like, well, do you not have anything critical to say about Durkheim? And so it was this real process of sort of, pushing at different things that each of us thought of as important and wanted to engage with and take forward. But it was a fun process to do, and particularly, I mean, for me, it was to go back to some of these the writings, and for me, particularly in relation to Du Bois, because I'd read Du Bois quite extensively previously, but now in a period, and it was during the period of lockdown, so there wasn't a huge amount else that it was possible to do. So it provided a concentrated period in which it was possible to read and then think about what was being read. And just going through Du Bois's writings and reading them and just thinking, I knew he was good, but I didn't really understand quite how good he was until I'd read all this in this particular form. So it was nice to make these new discoveries as well in relation to the readings that we were doing.
Thank you, Gurminder. Thank you, John. This has been I really enjoy your emphasis on the dialogue and how you converse and how it was fun to do so. And I think why you've mentioned this, I think it might be a good trigger in a sense to invite the other participants and continue this dialogue. So Stephen and Ipek, would you like to join us? And do you have any comments or questions for John and for Gurminder?
Thank you very much. Steve, shall I go, or would you like to go first? Okay, I think he's muted, so okay, I'll go ahead. Well, thank you very much to Christian for organizing, and to John and Gurminder. This is, of course, a wonderful book, an extensive elaboration and analysis of modern social theory, and like Christian said, you take us kind of on a journey, rereading Marx, Durkheim, Weber, but also others through a new lens. And in a way, the book not only rethinks authors, as you mentioned, it flags up how their contemporary, more recent interpretations have erased traces of empire, colonialism, and race from these seminal works, and kind of created a sociological and political theory canon devoid of these. And I really like the fact that how, the book brings attention back to Europe, yet challenges Eurocentrism. And there is the sentence that sums up when you say the one part of the world most in need of such analysis is Europe itself. So I thought that was very interesting, in the sense kind of saying that we need to kind of resist post-colonialism and decolonial studies to always look elsewhere, Latin America, Middle East, and so on, but also to Europe, yet with a different lens. I have kind of two general comments about kind of political context, general questions. If you want, I'll ask those, and then I have specific ones on Marx and so on. So I'll do the general ones first. So one of them is about how how social theory and sociology got caught out in the context of the rise of white nativism. And I mean, I myself was more surprised about the surprise of some sociologists to the rise of Trump and to Brexit. I mean, these weren't perhaps surprises if you were watching, but it seems only some were watching. And in that context, why sociology got caught out is an important question. So it would be interesting if you can expand on why you think this happened and how it links to the main thread of the arguments in the book. And the second related question to this is the relationship between social movements and social theory. So kind of following on from the first point, I kind of want to remind others that how you start the book by talking about the financial crisis of 2008 and how it should make us, pushes us, or pushed economics, at least initially, to question its assumptions, Similarly, how Trump and Brexit and the so-called revolt of ordinary citizens calls for a reflection on sociology's failure to recognize underlying currents and analysis. So there's a sociological failure here which you identify. And of course, reading your book, the failure you identify was partially, at least, is the absence of colonialism, empire, and race from mainstream sociological accounts and their contemporary interpretations. One question, however, remains is kind of regarding social movement. So if we think about the 2008, where you start out, the financial crisis, it had social movements and protests as well, but it didn't last long. So in terms of economics departments, they teach economics theory not perhaps much differently. How much banks and other institutions learned is also questionable. So it's kind of back to business. So in terms of sociology and social theory and the need to bring in colonialism and race to analysis, of course, we have that kind of racial awakening also enabled by Black Lives Matter and so on. In other words, we have the social movements pushing for change. So there's a zeitgeist now, both at universities intellectually, but also social movements kind of in the street and other spheres. But if and when the social movement dissipates, what will remain of social theory? What needs to happen to our disciplines, teaching and research? So that when the social movement is gone, the shift in thinking still remains. What do you want that shift to be, so that it doesn't get subsumed by diversity training? I will stop here. I have other more specific questions about Marx and Durkheim. Thank you. I'll come back to those later.
John Gurminder, would you like to respond to these?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, in terms of what will remain, I think it partly points to the way in which sociology as a discipline has taken up some of these issues in the past. I mean, in a way, our book isn't about race. It is about colonialism, and it's about the ways in which colonial processes establish particular forms of hierarchy, which often correlate to issues of race, and how those come to be reproduced. And one of the reasons for insisting on this is partly that I have a sense that the way in which race has been taken up within sociology has often been in terms of issues of identity, or then inequalities that are internal to particular societies, as opposed to thinking about how these issues of inequality have been formed in the context of global processes, and effectively those processes are of colonization. So in that sense, again, it's pushing this argument that it's not an additive approach. It's not just now that we add colonialism to be another topic within sociology, but how would taking colonial structures seriously reshape the ways in which we think about the discipline. And so in that sense, that's the sort of push that we're arguing for.
Yeah, can I add that in relation to issues around social movements as well? Because I think it goes to the theme of dialogue that we discussed with Christian. I think the impact of social movements within and upon sociology is in relation to the need to learn from others with different kinds of paradigmatic experiences, if you wish to put it like that. So one can understand that in terms of feminism and how feminism had an impact upon sociology. But that program, I think sociology has become a bit ossified since then and has sort of formalized itself. And one can think if learning from others requires that learning to make a difference to your categories and understanding, and that means being open to dialogue. And one of the methodological points that we draw out from the book is the way in which sociology positions itself in relation to dialogue, that it has a set of categories that are, in a sense, the possession of the discipline, and dialogue takes place on the ground of those categories, rather than the process of dialogue being one that shifts the ground of your own self-understanding. And that's what we wish to push forward around the issue of dialogue. And I think, although I didn't quite realize it at the time and that it would take this kind of direction, one could say that the significant thing about the Occupy movement, which related to the financial crisis of 2008, was that it was a movement for dialogue. It wasn't making a demand other than a demand for the public space to be opened. And therefore, it was a challenge to social sciences, but it was a different kind of challenge. I think you're correct that economics has looked at that challenge and decided, no, let's not bother, let's just carry on nudging people in the direction that we would wish. But I think it does pose a bigger challenge to sociology, and it means taking seriously what we understand by dialogue and how we put ourselves at issue within that. For me, there were quite important formative experiences engaging with the Birmingham Trojan Horse affair, to think, you know, at that point, living in Birmingham as a majority minority ethnic city, a majority minority religion city. It was very difficult to think about sociology, issues of social justice, without thinking of the language, the local languages in which social justice was mediated, the languages of religion. So it did involve thinking, what does it mean to have dialogue in a situation where the discipline itself has established its categories as unremittingly secular, if you wish. So trying to relax that secular set of assumptions of sociology was also something that came to me quite powerfully through thinking about the Trojan Horse affair, and then thinking about how the Trojan Horse affair was an expression of post-colonial Britain, as well as, in a sense, opening up areas of weakness in sociology's engagement. And so I think, yes, social movements, engagement with others, but with quite surprising effects. And that, I mean, we might come back to that in the discussion of Durkheim, because that was where one saw, Durkheim is doing something a little bit different from the other classical sociologists. His approach to issues of religion offered a different kind of space for thinking about religion, post-coloniality, and current debates in the public sphere.
So, John, you started answering one of my specific questions, so I'll follow on with those if that's okay. Thank you. Yeah. So one of them, I called it the Muslim question. So it is, of course, in the book you refer to and draw from Field's article on this imaginary conversation interaction between Durkheim and Du Bois. And there's Durkheim and his discussion on the Jewish question, the Dreyfus affair, and then there's Du Bois and his concerns about the Negro question. So if we put you both into that conversation, or your book, let's say, how would you engage with them? So how would you dialogue with them vis-a-vis the Muslim question in Europe today? And where does Marx's on the Jewish question come into it? How does it sit? So that's one question. If I can ask the other two, and then you can have a go at all of them, if that's all right, specific ones. So the other one is this thing about if Marx is redeemable, if Marx can be joined up with or redeemed with decolonial approaches, right? So, I mean, I really like the section on Marx in the book, perhaps because of various reasons, but it was also really interesting in the sense that, you know, how central to Marx's theorization was this notion of abstract labor, that the worker could see his or her labor as alien, and thus as something he or she could sell in the market. So most teaching of Marx or thick considerations of Marx and alienation is on his early understandings, which are kind of psychological, okay for first-year undergraduates, yet his later discussion of alienated labor is very much connected to this notion of abstract labor, that the laborer could see their labor as abstract and alien and thus exchangeable, being central to capitalism. And of course, this commodified free labor is something you take up and problematize. And for Marx, colonialism and imperialism, slavery, yes, they were bad, but they were bad and horrible outcomes of capitalism, not its foundation, right? So, so in that sense, you don't see perhaps Marx as redeemable, but I kind of would like your answer regarding how Marx sits. And my last question, a particular question, is about universalism and social theory in particular. So the book, I kind of was wondering how some of the shortcomings you identify in modern social theory that your book identifies arise due to the commitment social theory has made to universalism, whilst in fact writing about from particular experiences and stances. So how can we do social theory without universalism and particularism if we are not just engaging with existing authors, but trying to create new conceptual understandings and categories? Thank you very much.
Well, I think we're going to have several goes at answering this. Let me take the implications of the Muslim question first, because it's an area where we came to see Durkheim as different from how he'd otherwise been presented. So if you say the relation, Durkheim on the Jewish question, Marx on the Jewish question, what is the difference? So one of the things I think is that Durkheim is not regarding religion as pathological. He is not, in a sense, arguing that for a stadial theory, he's arguing that religion expresses something about the human condition. And one of the ways we put it, and take from Karen Fields, that if Locke said in the beginning all the world was America to indicate a move in a developmental sequence, Durkheim is arguing the opposite. In the end, we are all indigenous Australians. That is, we can understand, by understanding indigenous religion, what the nature of the essence of religion is, and therefore how it connects with modern forms of solidarity. So I think in that sense, although Durkheim is presented as a secular theorist, he's not identifying secularism as a post-religious phenomenon. What he's arguing is that a secular framework is a framework within which different religions can negotiate their presence and the forms of solidarity peculiar to them. So I would say that what Durkheim does is argue that secularism is itself a form of religion, and consequently he places the issue of the relationships between the secular and the religious as interfaith dialogue, not as the supersession of religion by secularism, but something that there's something common to each. So in that sense, the Muslim question is answered by understanding that within Islam, within all forms of religious belonging, is something necessary and essential about human solidarity that we need to negotiate in the modern world. So in that sense, his answer to the Jewish question is also opening up the space for an answer to a contemporary Muslim question. The problem is that despite France being involved in Algeria and so on, Durkheim neglects that, so one has to derive from it. But it does raise, a profound issue which Du Bois raises, and that is, and how do we shift it? And I think shifting our language of secularism will do it. What does it mean to be a problem? The Negro problem, the Muslim problem, the Jewish problem. For those who have to live as the problem for others, and how do we displace that by understanding that what is intrinsic to those different modes of being is something common across all of us. So I think there's something really quite hopeful in the way in which Durkheim deconstructs that issue, and does so without arguing that, well, what we need is to imagine the end of religion, and that we have to imagine modernity as an unfinished project, that insofar as religion continues to be significant, it's because modernity has not yet completed its telos. What Durkheim is saying, well, if religion disappeared from the world, we would face a possibility that we lived in a world characterized only by egoistic enemy. So I'll pause at that.
Okay, I mean, I'll maybe quickly, briefly respond to the Marx question, and perhaps leave the other one till later, because Christian, I imagine we're sort of coming up to time in terms of this part of the section. I mean, just one thing in relation to Marx. I mean, he has this, does recognize the role of colonialism and colonial history, specifically in the relation of primitive accumulation. But this is something that's is presented as part of the prehistory of capitalism. And once capitalism comes into being, then colonialism disappears, or it then gets transformed in the writing of some thinkers into imperialism, but it's a form of imperialism separated from the colonial histories that are prior to it. And so in part, I think what we're sort of pushing for in relation to a rethinking of Marx is thinking about those colonial histories as continuous through the emergence of capitalism, not just as something that's prior and then transformed, but how does colonialism itself come to configure what it is that we otherwise understand as capitalism? And one of the ways of doing that is to sort of shift away from this idea of thinking of capitalism as simply being about the capital-labor relation, where the labor is understood as free labor. And if we take into account the fact that during the time that Marx is writing, and probably sort of much beyond as well, free labor is far in terms of the amount. You have coerced labor, enslaved labor, unfree labor is the more dominant form of labor. And in fact, if we take that seriously, what we see and are interested in is not just the commodification of labor, but the commodification of the laborer. And if we take that seriously, how does that then transform our understandings of capitalism to make it much more continuous with colonialism? But I'll end there and then perhaps move to Steve and perhaps pick up some of the other questions from Ipek in the general discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Gurminder. I meant to suggest that, so I'm a bit conscious of time, but then, I mean, we've still got some flexibility with this concept, so we don't have to be super strict, because I think we have a very nice dialogue and good conversation going on. But yeah, so I think, Ipek, if it's okay with you, we could reserve your final question for the discussion later on. So Stephen, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your questions?
Oh, thanks very much for that. Yeah, just to say, I really enjoyed reading this book, and I learned a great deal from it. I've got quite a few questions, but I'm just going to really cut them down. So one that I wanted to ask was that when you talk about different thinkers in the book, in some cases you talk quite a lot about kind of methodology, you talk about it quite directly, whereas in other cases it seems to be more in the background. I was wondering whether you thought Du Bois in particular had made important contributions to questions of method and methodology. And I just wanted to tag on to the end of that a slightly different question that was just raised by that previous discussion, which was to ask, if Parsons had included Du Bois in the structure of social action, what might he have said about him and how would he have positioned him?
Go on.
Oh. Well, I think the issue about of methodology is significant because in a sense we reserve that for mostly for the discussion of Marx and for Weber, because there's a particular way in which methodological discussions, whether around interpretivism or around critical realism, played out as a debate between Marx and Weber. We do have a bit of a discussion of how Durkheim is different in that context, but the framing essentially is to challenge the idea that there are a set of universal categories. So that's the question that Ipek raised. So is universalism the problem? Well, we think that the idea of a set of categories which are outside the process of revision is the problem. And the categories that are outside the process of revision are essentially those of general theory in either of its forms, critical realism or interpretivism, as in Weber's ideal types. Each of them restricts the space in which reconstruction takes place and says that reconstruction is within this framework rather than including this framework. So for us, we say, well, when in giving up the idea of general categories, we're not arguing for a relativist position, we're arguing for a problem-solving position. Problem-solving produces better accounts, but we don't have to think of the better accounts in terms of approaching the truth. We can think of the better accounts in terms of leaving behind something that is inadequate in order to bring up new problems that have to be confronted in the same sort of way. So in that sense, if Parsons had addressed Du Bois, he would have had to have recognized the pragmatist understanding that's in Du Bois, which means that Du Bois is hostile to general categories as well, and is primarily putting forward a problem-solving position. So it would have been really challenging to Parsons' project of general theory to have included Du Bois, or indeed to have included anybody from within that pragmatist tradition. So essentially, he argues the tradition is empiricist, and it's easy for people to say it's empiricist because if you don't believe in a set of general categories, that's almost enough for you to be called empiricist rather than to be thought of as post-positivist, that is, open to theoretical categories being reconstructed and redefined. So that's the first thing. I think, however, if Parsons had read Du Bois and read him with the same sympathy that he addressed the issue of race briefly in the 1960s, I mean, the interesting thing about Parsons is he writes almost nothing about race. And one of the reasons why he writes nothing about race is because it comes into conflict with his idea of the development of social rights, the rise of modernity, democratization, and so on. So race in America is a fundamental challenge to the idea of democratization. In the 60s, Parsons has a brief moment when he says that perhaps the movement of African Americans is the movement of American socialism. And as American socialism, it's a movement for social rights for all. And Parsons said, and that's what Du Bois had argued much earlier, that the positive feature of Black Reconstruction was it posited social rights for all. It wasn't a particularistic movement. So Parsons could have got there earlier, and he might have recognized in the same article, and this is in the article Full Citizenship from the American Negro, ? And the fact that he puts a question mark is, I think, the only space where Parsons has any doubt about his general optimistic account of the future. But so by putting a question mark there, he says, well, what is the possible alternative to African-American equality brought about by the Agency of African-American Equality? And he says, I doubt if it's going to happen, but it's Barry Goldwater and it's the radical right. And that's actually what happened. So I think the moment is very crucial when the civil rights movement is, in a sense, stopped from being a full social rights movement as Parsons anticipated. And in effect, African Americans were once again lost, not only their own claim for rights, but also the claim that they were bringing forward for the rights for others. And that's in Du Bois. And so I think Parsons missed both a methodological argument and he missed a substantive argument about race in America.
Sorry, that's great. Thank you for that. I'll just ask one other question because then surely we want to kind of throw it open to everyone else. But my other question would be that, just to say that unsurprisingly, given the title of your book, you discuss the ideas of kind of the modern and modernity a lot. I wonder what you'd make of Bruno Latour's suggestion that we have never been modern and whether that's useful or not from a decolonial perspective.
I mean, so one thing in relation to Latour's idea of we have never been modern is that partly in the book, he talks about the fact that there's a particular group, a tribe in Africa that I think he's researching upon. And he sort of says, you know, this particular group, imagine that they constitute the entirety of the world. Isn't that a ridiculous claim? Surely we should treat the fact that Europeans consider themselves as modern as similarly ridiculous. It's just the claim that a group is making. And I think that, you know, that's fine as far as it goes. But the one difference is that whilst Europeans claim their modernity, they've managed to persuade, whether through persuasion or force, most of the rest of the world also to believe in that modernity. So it's not just a claim that's being made in the world, but it's a claim that's come to have a particular force in the world. And to undo that claim would require the sort of work that we're engaged in terms of demonstrating the fact that the modernity that Europe claims for itself was only ever possible through the colonial histories that enable that and then enforce that around the world. So I think that Latour gets halfway there, but doesn't really take us very far.
So I'd like to thank everyone, for attending to today's events and, for engaging with us in this really stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. So yeah, thanks so much, Gurminder, John, Ipek, Stephen, for attending this today.
Great. Thank you so much for organizing. And it was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you. There's just a reminder, there's nothing more fun than talking about sociology. So thank you.